The chapel was silent, save for the soft sobs of a grieving family and the low hum of a folded flag being passed into a widow's trembling hands. Sergeant Daniel Hart had survived 2 tours overseas and years in the K-9 unit, but a silent heart attack took him in his sleep, leaving behind a wife, a young son, and 1 devastated German shepherd. Biscuit, his loyal K-9 partner, hadn't moved since they brought the casket in. No amount of coaxing, calling, or pleading could break his stillness until the final prayer ended. Then, with a sudden burst of instinct and heartbreak, Biscuit leapt onto the casket and lay across it, guarding his fallen partner one last time. Then came the howling deep, mournful and raw, as if grief itself had found a voice. And when a small recorder dropped from Biscuit's collar, playing Daniel's final words to the dog that saved his life, the tears flowed freely. This wasn't just a story of loss, it was a story of undying loyalty, a bond that even death couldn't break. And what Biscuit did next would etch this moment into the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. The soft whispers of the mourners were the only sounds that filled the cemetery chapel, the air heavy with grief. The flag-draped casket stood at the front, untouched by time, its edges a reminder of the duty and honor Sergeant Daniel Hart had carried throughout his life. Flanked by rows of folding chairs, each occupied by someone who had loved or respected him, the room held a solemn stillness. Family, friends, fellow soldiers, and police officers all had gathered to say their final goodbyes. At just 42 years old, Daniel Hart's life had been cut tragically short. A decorated veteran of both the Army Rangers and the local K-9 unit, he had served with distinction and courage, saving lives and protecting the innocent. But the world can be unforgiving, and no one expected the quiet heart attack that had taken him in his sleep. His sudden death left a void that could never be filled, not for his family, not for his comrades, and certainly not for his loyal companion Biscuit. The German shepherd lay motionless at the foot of the casket, his gaze fixed on the flag-covered box. His dark eyes never strayed, not even when the soft strains of the bagpipes began to play. He had not eaten in days, his once energetic and joyful demeanor replaced by the stillness of mourning. The dog was not simply grieving, he was guarding. Guarding his partner, his handler, his best friend. Biscuit's fur was glossy, but there was no warmth left in it, no energy. His ears twitched at the haunting melody of the bagpipes, but he made no move to stand or acknowledge anyone else in the room. He had been with Daniel for nearly 8 years through the roughest, most dangerous moments of his career. They had been more than just a team. They had been brothers. The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. Marie Hart, Daniel's widow, stood beside the casket, her eyes swollen with grief, her face pale and drawn. She held their son, Noah, close to her side. At just 10 years old, Noah had lost his father far too soon. His small, fragile body trembled against Marie's, and his eyes were wide, trying to process a reality that no child should ever have to understand. The only comfort he had been in his mother's arms and in Biscuit's quiet presence by the casket. Marie's hands were shaking as she reached down to rest a hand on Biscuit's back. The dog shifted his weight slightly but didn't look at her. His body was tense, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders, much like Daniel had always been. She bent down, her voice barely a whisper. "It's okay, boy," she murmured softly, hoping the dog could somehow understand her. "He's gone now." Biscuit's ears twitched at her voice, but still he didn't move. His focus remained solely on Daniel's casket, as though he could not know, would not let go of the man he had protected for so many years. A single tear slipped down Marie's cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, not wanting Noah to see her cry. But her grief was palpable, and Biscuit, sensing it, looked up briefly, his amber eyes locking with hers. For a fleeting moment, there was a silent understanding between them. She had lost her husband, and Biscuit had lost his partner, his protector, the one who had given him purpose. As the ceremony continued, the honor guard approached, each movement precise, rehearsed. They stood by the casket, carefully folding the flag that had covered Daniel's body. Every fold, every crease, was a mark of respect, a final salute to the man who had served his country and his community with unyielding loyalty. As they completed the fold, one of the officers stepped forward to pass the neatly folded flag to Marie. The room held its breath as the officer approached her, kneeling before her with the flag in hand. Marie's hands trembled as she accepted it, clutching it close to her chest as if it could somehow fill the empty space where Daniel used to be. The weight of the moment seemed unbearable. This small piece of fabric, folded so carefully, was the final symbol of everything Daniel had stood for. Biscuit watched the exchange with a quiet intensity. His dark eyes never left the flag as it passed from one hand to another. The dog's chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths, as though he were struggling with the enormity of the loss. And then, just as the last notes of the bagpipes faded into the distance, something happened, something no one could have predicted. Biscuit's body tensed, and without warning, he sprang to his feet. The movement was sudden, but it was driven by something deep within him, instinct, perhaps, or an unspoken bond that only he and Daniel had shared. The mourners gasped as the large German shepherd leapt onto the casket. The action was so quick, so unexpected, that it seemed as though time had stopped. Some tried to call him down, but Biscuit was already in place, his body stretched across the flag-draped casket, his head resting gently on the wood. It was as if he were keeping watch, just as he had done for years when they were on patrol. His body, tense and strong, seemed to protect the man who could no longer protect him. A stunned silence filled the room. No one knew how to react. A few gasped, others reached for their phones to capture the moment, but no one could truly comprehend the depth of what was happening. Biscuit's howl, soft at first, began to rise from his throat, low and aching like a lament. It wasn't a howl of fear, nor was it one of aggression. It was pure sorrow. The grief of a creature that had lost not just his handler, but his heart. His best friend. Marie's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward. Biscuit's eyes flickered up to her, and for the first time since they had entered the chapel, he seemed to acknowledge her presence. His ears drooped slightly and his body, which had been so stiff, softened. He moved closer to Marie, his gaze never leaving her. Marie knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his head. She was too overcome to speak, but the quiet understanding between them was stronger than any words. She hadn't just lost her husband, Biscuit had lost his partner. Together they shared the pain of the loss, bound by love and loyalty. A single sob escaped Marie's throat, and she let the tears fall freely. It was the first time she allowed herself to cry openly in front of everyone. Her grief, so deeply entrenched in her soul, came flooding out. As the mourners stood in stunned silence, one thing became clear: this wasn't just a dog grieving his handler. This was a bond that transcended the human and animal worlds. Biscuit had not just been Daniel's partner. He had been his family, his protector, his equal. The room, heavy with emotion, seemed to shift in that moment. The pain was shared by all who were present, each person feeling the weight of the loss in their own way. And yet, there was something beautiful in Biscuit's mourning, a pure, undying loyalty that could never be broken even by death. No one knew how long Biscuit remained there, lying across the casket, but eventually the ceremony came to an end. The family was escorted away, but Biscuit stayed by the casket a little longer, his vigil never wavering. The room slowly emptied, but the memory of what had happened lingered etched in the minds of all who witnessed it. Biscuit had not only honored his partner in that moment, he had given everyone in the room a glimpse into the powerful bond between a soldier and his canine companion. It was a bond that, no matter what, would never fade. And as the last of the mourners filed out, a quiet, unspoken promise seemed to hang in the air. Biscuit would never let Daniel go. The chapel fell into an eerie hush as the chaplain's voice reverberated through the air, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime of service, sacrifice, and love. He spoke of Sergeant Daniel Hart's devotion, his courage, and his unwavering commitment to both his country and his family. Each syllable seemed to linger longer than necessary, as if the heavens themselves were reluctant to take the fallen soldier away. As the chaplain read the final lines, his voice softened, "And may he rest in peace." The words hung in the air, a delicate prayer for the soul of a man who had given so much. And then, as if the earth itself was responding to the gravity of the moment, a gust of wind swept through the trees outside the chapel. The windows rattled briefly, the faint rustling of leaves mingling with the quiet sobs that echoed from the mourners. The wind was the only sound that broke the silence for a fleeting moment. It was in that brief, suspended instant that Biscuit moved. His body had been so still, so utterly motionless throughout the ceremony, that when he suddenly rose, it startled everyone. The dog's large frame stood tall as he lifted his head, ears flicking back in the direction of the casket. He took one cautious step forward, then another. Then, with a quick, decisive movement, Biscuit leapt up onto the casket. A collective gasp rippled through the chapel. Marie froze, her breath caught in her throat. The mourners were still for a moment, unsure if this was some bizarre reflex or if the dog had simply lost his way in the confusion of the moment. A few of the soldiers exchanged worried glances, while others stood rigid, unsure whether to intervene. But Biscuit didn't seem lost. He wasn't confused. He wasn't frightened. He was there, and it was as if time slowed to a crawl the moment his paws hit the top of the casket. He lay flat across it, his long body stretched out, his chest pressed against the smooth wood, the very place where Daniel's heart had once beat. Biscuit's head dropped low, his snout resting just near where Daniel's heart would have been, still, calm, as if guarding what remained of his fallen partner. His eyes, so full of sorrow, locked onto the mourners below. His body was rigid, as though he were protecting the casket from any force that dared to come near. And then the sound came, a sound that shattered the quiet, echoing through the chapel like an ancient lament. Biscuit began to howl. It wasn't the sharp, frantic bark of a dog in distress. It wasn't a cry of anger or fear. This was a slow, deep, aching howl that rose from the depths of his chest, a sound so mournful that it seemed to come from the very soul of the animal. It was the kind of cry that spoke of a loss too vast for words, too deep for any living creature to understand fully. The mourners watched in silence as the dog's howl filled the air, growing in volume, yet never faltering in its sorrow. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt. The soldiers, some of whom had seen and experienced the brutality of war, couldn't hold back their tears. There was something primal in the way Biscuit cried, something universal that touched the heart of anyone who had ever known loss. The chaplain's voice cracked mid-sentence as he tried to speak through the grief, but his words were swallowed by the dog's desperate wail. Marie, standing beside the casket with Noah, could no longer contain herself. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to grasp for some sort of control. The sound that Biscuit made pierced through her, cutting deeper than anything she could have ever imagined. Her chest tightened, and the flood of emotion that had been building since Daniel's death overwhelmed her. She quickly covered her mouth, but the sobs came anyway. She didn't know whether it was the dog's sorrow or the realization that Daniel was truly gone, but the weight of it was too much for her to carry. Her legs gave way beneath her and she fell to her knees, her hands clutching at her heart, the pain too sharp, too real. Noah, her young son, clung to her side. His small hand wrapped around her arm as he looked up at Biscuit, his face a mixture of confusion and sadness. He didn't fully understand what was happening, what this loss meant, but the raw emotion emanating from both the dog and his mother told him more than words ever could. Biscuit's howl, slow and aching, echoed through the chapel like a dirge for the fallen. The mourners were all quiet now, each one caught in the undertow of the dog's grief. The soldiers, the officers, the friends and family, none of them were immune to the pain that radiated from that single loyal creature. But Biscuit wasn't finished. His howl began to taper off, but as if something inside him surged again, the dog suddenly sat up straight. His head turned slightly toward the back of the chapel, his ears alert as though hearing something distant, something none of the others could hear. The mourners exchanged puzzled looks, unsure what Biscuit was reacting to. But then, from beneath the dog's collar, there was a faint click. A small device fell loose from Biscuit's neck and rolled across the casket. It landed softly on the wooden surface, resting beside the flag. Marie, still on her knees, blinked at the strange sound. The chaplain too looked confused. The officers in uniform stepped forward, cautiously, unsure whether it was a malfunction or something else. Biscuit's gaze never wavered as they picked up the small recording device. It was an audio recorder, barely the size of a coin, with a single button on the side. The officer held it up and without anyone prompting him, he pressed the button. What came next was Daniel's voice. "Biscuit, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it home. But if Biscuit is still with you, it means I wasn't alone on the way out. He's not just a dog, he's family. He saved my life more times than I can count. He's given me something to believe in when I stopped believing in myself." The voice crackled but was unmistakably Daniel's, steady, familiar, filled with warmth. Marie's hands went to her mouth in disbelief. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, time seemed to stop again. There was something so deeply personal about hearing Daniel's voice again, as if he had somehow found a way to speak from beyond the grave. The room was still, the only sound the faint click of the recorder as it played on. Daniel's voice continued, each word etched with love for Biscuit, for Marie, for their family. "Biscuit, if you're listening, buddy, thank you. Watch over my family. You always knew how to guard what matters." The tears came again. This time they flowed freely. Some of the soldiers, veterans of war themselves, wiped their eyes, their tough exteriors cracking under the weight of the moment. The loss was universal now, shared not only by the family, but by everyone who had ever known the sacrifices of soldiers, of partners, of friends. And as the last words of the recording faded away, Biscuit lowered his head once again, resting it gently on the casket. His body sagged as if the weight of the world had been placed on him, and yet, there was a peace in him now. The howl had stopped, but the bond between him and Daniel, the love, the loyalty, they had been immortalized in that brief recording. Marie leaned forward, her heart breaking once more, but also filled with something else. A quiet gratitude for the man she had loved, and for the dog who had loved him back. The two of them together had kept a promise that death could not sever. For Biscuit the mission was clear: guard, protect, love forever. And so he stayed by the casket, his watch unbroken. As the mourners remained still, their eyes glued to the casket where Biscuit lay, the room felt heavier. The weight of the grief in the air was almost palpable, pressing against their chests. The sound of Biscuit's howls still echoed in the minds of the mourners, each one struggling to regain composure, but none of them would ever forget the deep sorrow that had filled the chapel. Marie's body trembled as she kneeled beside the casket, her hand still gently resting on Biscuit's fur. She looked up at the mourners, her heart caught in the whirlwind of emotions. But just as the air seemed to settle, a small, barely noticeable shift occurred. Biscuit, still curled at the foot of the casket, moved ever so slightly. His head dipped and his nose nudged something that had been tucked away beneath the thick fabric of his collar. The small object tumbled out, clinking softly as it rolled across the polished surface of the coffin. At first, the crowd didn't seem to notice, still too overcome with emotion to see what had just happened. But then, a handler who had been stationed nearby, a fellow officer who had worked with Daniel and Biscuit for years, stepped forward. He bent down slowly, reaching for the small, inconspicuous device that had fallen from beneath the dog's collar. At first he looked puzzled, not sure what he had found. His fingers brushed over the object's smooth surface before he picked it up fully, inspecting it with the cautious curiosity of someone unsure whether it was a piece of evidence or something far more personal. He held it up for the others to see, a small audio recorder no bigger than a coin. The group fell silent, eyes fixed on the device. The handler, his expression unreadable, turned it over in his hands and then glanced at Biscuit. The dog's amber eyes met his gaze for a fleeting moment before returning to the casket. His silence was almost eerie. The handler, feeling a surge of something unspoken, pressed the button on the recorder. A crackling sound filled the room, followed by Daniel's unmistakable voice, a voice that had once been full of command and strength, now tinged with something more intimate, softer, and profoundly moving. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it home. But if Biscuit is still with you, it means I wasn't alone on the way out. He's not just a dog, he's family. He saved my life more times than I can count, and he's given me something to believe in when I stopped believing in myself." The voice, though crackling, was so real, so alive. It carried the weight of Daniel's love for Biscuit, the same love that had carried them through countless dangers and impossible odds. The room was frozen, but for the soft sounds of breath catching in the throats of those who could hardly believe what they were hearing. Marie gasped, clutching Noah's hand tighter. Her grip was so firm that Noah winced slightly, but he didn't dare pull away. His gaze was fixed on the dog, on the casket, and on the recorder now playing Daniel's final words. He didn't fully understand it, but something deep inside him told him that this moment was sacred, one that would be seared into his heart for the rest of his life. Biscuit, if you're listening, buddy, thank you. Watch over my family. You always knew how to guard what matters. The room felt suffocating, the quiet between the words unbearable. For a few moments all anyone could do was listen. Even Biscuit seemed to pause at Daniel's voice, his body still, his breathing slow. The dog's amber eyes fluttered closed, as if in recognition, as if understanding, as if hearing a voice that was forever his. Tears flowed freely from the eyes of those present, soldiers who had seen the worst the world had to offer, police officers who had stood side by side with Daniel on countless calls, and family members who had loved him since he was a child. They all understood the gravity of what was unfolding. They had known the bond between man and dog was powerful, but the very essence of that bond was something more sacred than any of them could have imagined. Marie felt the air leave her lungs, the deep ache of Daniel's absence sharpening with every word that played. She pressed her hand to her chest as though she could somehow ease the weight of her heart, but it only seemed to grow heavier. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of Daniel's voice wash over her, and for a brief moment she could almost believe he was there. Almost believe he would come back. The handler slowly lowered the device, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at the mourners who had gathered, but none of them moved. The only sound now was the rhythmic breathing of Biscuit, who had gone quiet again. His body, still draped across Daniel's casket, was almost peaceful, as though the storm of grief had finally passed, leaving him in a strange kind of stillness. Marie slowly exhaled, her breath shaky. She stood up, her legs weak, and reached down to run her fingers through Biscuit's fur. Her heart felt broken and whole at the same time. It was as though a piece of Daniel had just been brought back to her. His voice, his love, his last words. But with that return came finality, a reminder that no matter how much love lingered, Daniel was gone. Her gaze flickered to Noah, who stood beside her, his small hand holding hers. He was still staring at the dog, his face set with something deeper than the confusion of a child. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes. As if, in that moment, he knew what Biscuit was, what he had been to his father and now to their family. A protector, a friend, a reminder of all the good in Daniel's life. Marie knelt down to him, wiping away the tears that had escaped her eyes, but not bothering to stop the rest. She leaned in and kissed the top of Noah's head, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll always be with us, baby. Always." Noah nodded, his face solemn as he gazed at Biscuit. "He's taking care of us, right, Mom?" His voice was small, but the certainty in it caught Marie off guard. "Yes," she replied, her own voice cracking. "He is." The handler, who had been standing by the casket with the recorder still in his hands, now moved away quietly, but not before casting one last look at Biscuit. The dog hadn't moved since the recording stopped, his eyes closed in a sort of repose, but his body still loyal as ever, protecting the man who had given him purpose. And for a long while, it seemed as though the world held its breath, as if waiting for the next step in the journey for both the family and their beloved K9. Biscuit had been more than just a dog to Daniel. He had been his partner, his brother, his most faithful friend. And now he was all they had left. As the day wore on and the funeral came to an end, no one could forget the profound moment they had witnessed. Biscuit had left behind a legacy not only as a dog, but as a symbol of undying loyalty. And for Marie, Noah, and everyone who had known Daniel, the memory of that moment would live on forever. It wasn't just a memorial for a soldier. It was a reminder that love, even in its deepest forms, never dies. The evening air was cool, the kind of chill that settled over the earth when the sun dipped low, leaving behind a lingering glow of gold and orange. It was a momentary peace, as if the world itself was giving Marie a brief respite from the heavy sorrow that had taken root in her heart. She sat on the porch of the house that she and Daniel had built together, the flag that had been draped over his casket folded neatly in her lap. Her fingers traced the edges of the fabric, the stars and stripes pressing against her skin in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. The weight of it was heavy, yet it didn't compare to the weight she now carried inside her. The weight of a life without Daniel, a life that she never thought she would have to face alone. Beside her, Biscuit sat silently, his gaze cast toward the horizon where the sun was slipping behind the trees. His body, once so strong and full of purpose, now seemed weary, his fur dull in the dimming light. His large amber eyes, though filled with sorrow, remained alert, still watchful, still ever faithful. Marie's voice broke the silence. "Did you know he recorded that?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper as if she feared disturbing the stillness around them. Biscuit didn't answer, of course. His only response was the slow movement of his head, his gaze unwavering, locked on hers. But it was enough. She knew he heard her. He always had. They had shared moments like this before, quiet moments of understanding, of grief, of love. The silence stretched between them, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of quiet that spoke more than words ever could. In that stillness, Marie felt the presence of Daniel again, felt him in the soft breeze, in the way Biscuit sat beside her, in the way her heart still beat for him. It wasn't gone. It couldn't be gone. Not yet. The next day after the funeral, things didn't seem to get any easier. The house was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of Daniel's footsteps, no calls of "Hey babe" when he came through the door. It was the absence of everything that had once made their home whole. But the hardest part was knowing that Daniel wasn't coming back, not physically. Not in the way she had prayed for, in the way she had hoped. But Biscuit was still here. Yet, the following morning, Biscuit refused to leave the cemetery. Marie watched from the window, her heart aching at the sight of the dog lying motionless by Daniel's grave. He hadn't moved since they left the funeral, his body stiff in the stillness of the cold morning. Family members, neighbors, and even officers who had come to pay their respects tried coaxing him to come home. They called his name, gently tugged at his leash, and offered treats. But the dog didn't budge. Biscuit stayed at the cemetery, as if tethered to something deeper than anyone could understand. He remained there, unmoving, as though his heart could not pull him away from the one person he had been destined to protect. Marie's chest tightened with every passing hour as she watched him from the window, but no matter what she did, no matter how much she pleaded for him to return, Biscuit remained a silent sentinel, guarding the final resting place of his best friend. It was as though, in his mind, Daniel wasn't truly gone. He was simply out of sight. And then, just when it seemed that Biscuit might never leave, something shifted. Noah, still in his pressed shirt from the funeral, walked out onto the porch. He stood still for a moment, looking out at the dog lying motionless in the distance. His small hands were stuffed deep in his pockets, but the determination in his eyes was unmistakable. Noah, in his 10-year-old wisdom, understood something that no one else seemed to grasp, not fully. Biscuit was not just a dog. He had been Daniel's protector, his partner, his family. And now he needed someone to protect. The boy walked toward the cemetery, his steps slow, hesitant at first, but gaining purpose with every movement. Marie followed behind, watching him with a mixture of love and fear, but she didn't stop him. She couldn't. Noah reached Biscuit, who remained still, unmoving as if frozen in place. He knelt down beside the dog, his small knees pressing against the cold earth, and then he spoke in a soft, steady voice. "Biscuit, come home," Noah whispered. His voice trembled, but he didn't let it break. "We need you." For a moment nothing happened. The dog's large eyes were fixed on the grave, distant, unfocused. His body, heavy with grief, lay unyielding. But then, a soft sigh seemed to escape Biscuit's chest, and his head slowly turned toward the boy. There was something so human in the way his eyes softened, the way his body seemed to release the tension that had been there for hours. And then, as if hearing Noah's plea for the first time, Biscuit stood. His legs were shaky at first, his muscles stiff from hours of laying motionless, but with one last glance at Daniel's grave, the dog took a hesitant step forward. He nuzzled Noah's face gently, his warm tongue brushing the boy's cheek. A quiet, almost imperceptible whine escaped his throat, and Noah's eyes welled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. "Thank you, Biscuit," Noah whispered, his voice small and filled with emotion. And then the two of them, boy and dog, began the walk back home. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. But it was a beginning. With every step Noah took, Biscuit followed beside him, his pace steady, his loyalty unbroken. For the first time since Daniel's death, Marie felt a flicker of hope. She watched from the porch as her son and Biscuit walked side by side, their silhouettes outlined by the setting sun. It was a slow, deliberate walk, but there was something undeniably powerful in it. The bond between Noah and Biscuit had been forged in tragedy, but now it was becoming something more. It was a promise that they would carry on together as a family. Biscuit had been Daniel's partner, his protector, and now he was Noah's. He would watch over him just as he had watched over his father, guiding him through the days to come, through the years ahead. No, Biscuit would never replace Daniel. But he was here. He was present. He was family. As they approached the porch, Marie stepped forward, her heart aching with both sorrow and love. She kneeled beside Noah and Biscuit, her hands resting gently on the dog's fur. "Welcome home, Biscuit," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." Biscuit leaned into her touch, his tail giving a slow, quiet wag. It wasn't the same, of course, it couldn't be. But it was enough. For now it was enough. And in that moment the family was whole again in their own way. 2 years had passed since that quiet, poignant moment when Biscuit had finally walked home from the cemetery with Noah by his side. Time, as it does, had moved forward, slowly but inevitably, transforming grief into something more manageable, though still deeply felt. Yet, for Marie and Noah, some days felt as though the past was never far behind, and the Biscuit of Daniel's absence lingered over them. The day the statue was unveiled was one of those days. A perfect spring morning, the sun glinting off the polished stone and bright green grass at the local Veterans Park. A gentle breeze rustled the trees and a crowd had gathered, veterans, police officers, family and friends, all there to honor a man who had been more than a soldier, more than a husband, more than a father. Sergeant Daniel Hart was a hero, and so was his partner, K-9 Officer Biscuit. The large, bronze statue was revealed slowly, as the crowd held its collective breath. It was a powerful sight, a life-sized figure of a man kneeling beside his dog, both caught in a moment of quiet reverence. The dog, cast in the act of sitting beside the soldier, its head turned slightly upward as though looking to its handler with unwavering trust. Daniel was captured in his army uniform, a hand resting gently on Biscuit's back. It was more than just a memorial, it was a tribute to the bond they had shared, a bond that had been forged in battle and solidified in the quiet moments of everyday life. The plaque beneath the statue read, "In memory of Sergeant Daniel Hart and K-9 Officer Biscuit, brothers in life, and in the life after. Loyalty never dies." Marie stood with Noah beside the crowd, her hand wrapped tightly around her son's. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at the statue, her heart full of pride and sorrow. Daniel and Biscuit had been together for so long, their bond unbreakable. Even now, standing here, she could almost hear his voice, his laughter, his commanding tone when he had called Biscuit's name. She imagined for a moment that Daniel was watching from somewhere beyond, proud of the life he had led and the love that had surrounded him. Noah, now 12, stood at attention, his small chest puffed out with the gravity of the moment. The day had come full circle, and as the crowd cheered and clapped, Noah lifted his right hand to his brow in a crisp salute. He had learned that gesture from his father and had carried it with him ever since Daniel's passing. It was something sacred between soldiers, and Noah understood it now more than ever. Marie watched as the crowd gathered around the statue, many of them reaching out to touch the bronze, others silently wiping away tears. She knew this moment would never be forgotten, not by her, not by Noah, and certainly not by the town. But what moved her most was the presence of Biscuit, who had been a silent part of this moment, even though he had passed away not long after Daniel. Biscuit had stayed with the Hart family every day since Daniel's death. He had never truly left. He slept at the foot of Noah's bed, a comforting presence during the night. He would bark at Biscuits in the corner of the room as though protecting them from some unseen threat, and when Marie cried, when the weight of the world became too much to bear, Biscuit was there, always at her side, resting his head gently on her lap, offering a quiet kind of solace that only a dog could. But as time passed, the toll of those years began to show. Biscuit was older now, his movements slower, his once vibrant coat beginning to lose its luster. And then one morning when the sun had barely risen, Biscuit lay down on his favorite spot in the living room, just near the window where Daniel had always sat. His breathing was shallow, his eyes tired, but there was peace in him, peace that came from a life well lived, from a duty fulfilled. Marie had stayed with him until the end, her hands gently caressing the dog's fur. And when Biscuit finally closed his eyes for the last time, she whispered, "You did it, boy. You stayed just like he asked. You kept your promise." They buried Biscuit next to Daniel as they had always planned. It felt fitting, almost like a natural conclusion to a story that had been written in the hardest of times. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Marie, with Noah at her side, watched as they lowered Biscuit into the ground, the last of their family to be laid to rest. Noah saluted once more, just as he had at the statue unveiling, his small hand trembling in the wind. Marie placed her hand on his shoulder, holding him close, knowing that he understood the significance of this moment more than anyone else. Biscuit had kept his promise to Daniel, just as Daniel had kept his promise to the dog. They had been brothers in arms in life and now in death. From that day forward, on the anniversary of Daniel's funeral, people came to the park, some bringing flowers, some just to stand in quiet reflection. And every year the same small group gathered near the statue to hear the recording. The one that had been made during Daniel's final moments, the one that had played at his funeral. The one where Daniel's voice still echoed through the park. "Biscuit, if you're listening, buddy, thank you. Watch over my family. You always knew how to guard what matters." And every time it played, the crowd stood silent, many wiping away tears, some kneeling beside the statue, their hearts filled with the profound understanding that love and loyalty are timeless. The recording, Daniel's voice, lived on as a reminder of what had been, what was, and what could never be taken away. It was a legacy of loyalty between a man and his dog, a bond that transcended death itself. It was a bond that would forever echo in the hearts of those who had known them, and it would never be forgotten. As the years passed, the flowers would always bloom in front of the statue, and the sound of Daniel's voice would forever carry through the park, a constant reminder of the love, devotion, and loyalty that had marked the lives of Sergeant Daniel Hart and K-9 Officer Biscuit. And as the crowd slowly dispersed each year, there wouldn't be a dry eye in sight. For every time that recording played, it reminded them all that true loyalty never dies, it only endures, forever etched in the hearts of those who remember.